The winter of 1879 descended upon Montezuma, Colorado, with a vengeance that matched the cold fury in Lucille Parker's heart as she read the letter in her trembling hands, her third marriage proposal withdrawn in as many months. The paper crumpled in her grip while she fought back tears that threatened to freeze on her cheeks in the bitter mountain air. The reason was always the same. Her silence made people uncomfortable. Too quiet, they said. Hardly speaks a word. Can't have a wife who won't entertain guests. The excuses varied, but the meaning remained constant. Her reserved nature was considered a flaw, something broken that needed fixing. At 22, Lucille had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through town. The daughter of the late Reverend Parker had always been peculiar, folks said. After her father's passing last spring, the pressure to marry had become relentless. A woman alone couldn't maintain the small homestead on the outskirts of Montezuma, especially not one as seemingly fragile as Lucille. But they mistook her quietness for weakness. In truth, Lucille observed everything, absorbed the world deeply, and simply found most conversations lacking substance worth her contribution. Why waste words when a gesture or expression could communicate what was necessary? She stuffed the letter into her coat pocket and continued along the snowy path toward Holloway's general store. The mining town was bustling despite the cold prospectors, merchants, and settlers preparing for the harsh winter ahead. Lucille pulled her woolen scarf tighter around her face, partially to ward off the cold, partially to hide from the pitying glances that would inevitably come her way once word of yet another rejection spread. The bell above Holloway's door jingled as she entered, and several heads turned in her direction. Mrs. Baxter and Mrs. Whitman huddled by the fabric counter, their conversation halting abruptly. Lucille nodded politely and moved toward the grocery section, mentally calculating how much flour and sugar she could afford. "Miss Parker," Mr. Holloway greeted from behind the counter, his voice overly cheerful. "Cold enough for you," Lucille offered a small smile and nodded again. "Heard about the Henderson boy," he continued, lowering his voice. "Shame that. His mother said he just couldn't abide the idea of a wife who, well," he cleared his throat awkwardly. "A wife who knows when to hold her tongue," came a deep voice from behind her. Lucille turned to find herself face to face with a tall stranger. His eyes were the color of the sky just before dusk, and despite the winter chill, his skin was sun-darkened beneath a short beard. He wasn't dressed like the miners or the townspeople, but rather in the practical gear of someone who spent long days in the saddle-worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a heavy sheepskin coat, and a Stetson that had seen better days. "Owen Elliott," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. "Just passing through. Don't mind me butting in, but where I come from, a woman who doesn't prattle on about nothing is worth her weight in gold." Mr. Holloway laughed uncomfortably. "Well, our Lucille here takes it to an extreme, Mr. Elliott. Why, sometimes we wonder if she's got anything to say at all." Lucille's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her expression neutral, a skill perfected over years of enduring such comments. "Is that right?" Owen Elliott replied, his gaze never leaving Lucille's face. "Well, I've known men who died because they couldn't stop running their mouths when silence was called for." He smiled then, a genuine expression that softened his weathered features. "Sometimes the quiet ones are just waiting for someone worth talking to." Lucille felt something shift inside her, not quite hope, but perhaps the distant cousin of it. She finished her shopping in silence, aware of Owen Elliott's presence as he selected his own supplies. When she approached the counter to pay, she discovered he had moved aside to let her go first. "Thank you," she said softly, the words barely audible. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sound of her voice and the corner of his mouth lifted. "You're welcome, Miss Parker." As she gathered her purchases to leave, he fell into step beside her. "Mind if I walk with you? These mining towns can get rowdy even in daylight." Lucille hesitated. She didn't know this man, and yet there was something about him that didn't set off the alarms that usually sounded when men paid her attention. Perhaps it was the way he seemed comfortable with her silence, not rushing to fill it with nervous chatter. After a moment's consideration, she nodded her consent. They walked through the snowy streets side by side, their breath creating matching clouds in the cold air. Owen Elliott didn't press her to speak, didn't ask the usual questions about why she was so quiet or suggest she'd be prettier if she smiled more. Instead, he occasionally commented on the scenery or pointed out an interesting sight, requiring no response beyond her acknowledgement. When they reached the fork in the road where her path led to the homestead, Lucille paused. Social convention dictated she should thank him for his escort and bid him goodbye, but the words stuck in her throat as they always did around strangers. Owen seemed to understand. "It's been pleasant walking with you, Miss Parker." He glanced toward the setting sun. "I should find lodging before dark. Is there an inn you'd recommend?" Lucille hesitated, then spoke carefully, each word deliberate. "Widow Sullivan takes boarders. 2nd Street, blue house with white trim." His smile widened at her response. "Much obliged." He tipped his hat again. "Perhaps I'll see you around town during my stay." As she watched him walk away, Lucille realized she'd spoken more to this stranger in one encounter than she had to most townspeople in months. Something about Owen Elliott put her at ease, though she couldn't quite identify what. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, she turned toward home, pushing aside the small seed of curiosity he'd planted. Owen's business in Montezuma, whatever it was, surely wouldn't involve her. Men like him, competent, confident, handsome, didn't linger around women like her. They wanted vivacious, charming companions who could entertain and impress, not silent shadows who faded into the background of any social gathering. Still, as she prepared her simple supper that evening, Lucille found herself wondering about the stranger who didn't seem bothered by her quietness. It was a dangerous line of thought. Hope had proven a fickle friend in the past, and she had no reason to believe this time would be different. But as she sat alone by the fireplace, listening to the wind howl outside her cabin walls, she allowed herself one small, secret smile. Today, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had made her feel like her silence wasn't a shortcoming but a virtue. It was a novel sensation, one she wasn't entirely sure how to process. Tomorrow would likely return to the familiar pattern of averted gazes and awkward interactions. But tonight, Lucille wrapped herself in the memory of those few kind words like a blanket against the Colorado winter and found unexpected warmth there. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Lucille rose before the sun, as was her habit, to tend to her modest livestock, 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and an aging mule named Bartholomew. Her father had always insisted on self-sufficiency, a value that served her well now that she lived alone. The animals provided comfort in their simplicity. They didn't care if she spoke or remained silent. They responded to her gentle touches and consistent care without judgment. Sometimes Lucille found herself talking to them, freely quiet observations about the weather, memories of her father, or thoughts that troubled her mind. They listened without interruption or expectation. As she finished her chores and prepared to head into town for her twice-weekly position at the dressmaker's shop, Lucille spotted a figure approaching on horseback. Even from a distance, she recognized Owen Elliott's broad shoulders and distinctive hat. Her heart quickened inexplicably, and she busied herself with straightening her already neat woodpile. "Morning, Miss Parker," he called as he drew closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Hope I'm not intruding." Lucille shook her head, wiping her gloved hands on her apron. He dismounted gracefully, leading his horse, a magnificent chestnut, gelding toward her. "Widow Sullivan mentioned you might have space in your barn for boarding a horse. The livery's full up with the supply wagons that came through yesterday." Lucille glanced at her half-empty barn. There was certainly room, and the extra income would be welcome with winter settling in. She nodded and gestured for him to follow her. "Much obliged," Owen said, leading his horse inside. "We've been together too long for me to leave him with strangers. Caesar's particular about who tends him." He patted the horse's neck affectionately. Lucille showed him where the feed was stored and which stall he could use. As they worked together to settle the horse, she found herself relaxing in his presence. Owen moved with quiet efficiency, not feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. "You handle animals well," he observed as she offered Caesar an apple from her pocket. The horse took it delicately, then nudged her shoulder for more. "He's usually suspicious of new people." Lucille's lips curved slightly. "Animals don't expect conversation," she said softly. Owen's eyes warmed with understanding. "No, they don't, just honesty." He finished brushing Caesar down and turned to face her fully. "I wonder, Miss Parker, if I might ask another favor. I'm in need of a guide who knows this area. I've been commissioned to scout locations for a new stage line, and these mountains are unfamiliar territory." Lucille's eyebrows rose in surprise. People rarely sought her assistance for anything involving interaction. "I'd pay fair wages, of course," he continued, "and I suspect you know these hills better than most." He glanced at her practical attire and capable hands. "Unless I'm mistaken about that," she hesitated, weighing his offer. Her father had indeed taught her every trail and pass in the surrounding mountains, believing everyone should know how to navigate the wilderness. The extra money would certainly help see her through the winter. But spending days alone with a man she barely knew would set tongues wagging even more than usual. "I understand your hesitation," Owen said, correctly reading her expression. "It's not a conventional arrangement. Perhaps you'd prefer to recommend someone else." Lucille straightened her shoulders and made her decision. "I know the trails," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "When do you need to start?" Owen's face brightened. "Would tomorrow be too soon? I'd like to make progress before the next snowfall." She nodded. "Dawn, dress warmly." "I'll be here." He tipped his hat and moved toward the barn door, then paused. "Thank you, Miss Parker. I promise you won't regret this arrangement." As she watched him ride back toward town, Lucille wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The practical side of her brain pointed out all the reasons this was foolish. Her reputation, already fragile, would suffer further damage. A woman alone with a man in the wilderness for days would draw a harsh judgment from the town, yet something deeper, something long dormant, urged her forward. Perhaps it was the way Owen seemed to value her silence rather than find it unsettling. Or maybe it was simply the prospect of escaping the town's suffocating atmosphere, if only temporarily. Whatever the reason, Lucille spent the remainder of the day at the dressmaker's shop with her thoughts drifting toward the coming expedition, her fingers working automatically on the fine stitches that had made her valuable to Mrs. Hollister, despite her quiet nature. "You seem distracted today," Mrs. Hollister observed near closing time, her keen eyes missing nothing. "Something troubling you, dear?" Lucille shook her head, then reconsidered. Mrs. Hollister had always been kind to her, never pushing for conversation but accepting what little Lucille offered. "I've taken a job," she said carefully, guiding Mr. Elliott through the mountain passes. Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows shot up. "The handsome stranger, well now," she studied Lucille's face. "That will set Montezuma buzzing for certain." Lucille's shoulders tensed. "Oh, don't mind me, Mrs. Hollister said, waving a hand dismissively. "This town could use something new to talk about besides who's striking it rich and who's going bust. Besides," she added with a wink, "a man who seeks out your company rather than avoiding it deserves a chance, I'd say." Lucille felt her cheeks warm. "It's just work," she murmured. "Of course it is, dear." Mrs. Hollister smiled knowingly. "Just be careful up there. Mountains can be treacherous this time of year, and so can men, handsome or otherwise." That night, as Lucille prepared for the journey, packing provisions and checking her father's old maps, she tried to dismiss Mrs. Hollister's insinuations. Owen Elliott was simply a businessman who needed her expertise, nothing more. Men like him didn't pursue women like her, and she'd long since made peace with that reality. Yet as she laid out her warmest clothes and checked her father's old rifle, Lucille couldn't quite suppress a flutter of anticipation. Tomorrow would take her away from the pitying glances and uncomfortable silences of town. Tomorrow, her quietness would be an asset rather than a liability. Tomorrow, she would be valued for what she knew rather than judged for what she didn't say. It was, she realized as she finally drifted toward sleep, the first time in months she'd looked forward to the coming day. Owen arrived precisely at dawn, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies alongside Caesar. Lucille was already waiting, dressed in her father's old buckskin jacket, woolen trousers beneath her skirt, and sturdy boots. Her hair was braided tightly and tucked beneath a fur-lined hat. "You look prepared," Owen commented approvingly, dismounting to help secure her packs to the mule. "Most folks underestimate these mountains." Lucille nodded, checking the cinches on Bartholomew's saddle. She'd risen early to feed the animals and arrange for the neighbor boy, Tommy Wilson, to tend them during her absence. The 13-year-old had been eager for the responsibility and the coins she'd pressed into his hand. "I've packed enough provisions for 5 days," Owen explained as they worked, "though I hope to complete the survey in 3. The company wants a route that avoids the worst passes, but doesn't add more than half a day's travel to the current schedule." Lucille listened carefully, appreciating that he explained his business clearly without talking down to her. Too many men in town spoke to her as if her quietness indicated limited intelligence. "There are 3 possible routes," she said, pointing to the map she'd spread on a wooden crate. Her finger traced lines across the paper. "This one is shortest but dangerous in winter. This one adds half a day but avoids the worst terrain. The third is longest but safest year-round." Owen studied both the map and her face with equal intensity. "You've traveled all 3, she nodded. "With my father, he was called to outlying homesteads often." "The Reverend was well respected, I hear," Owen said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss." Lucille swallowed hard against the unexpected kindness. Most people had stopped mentioning her father months ago, uncomfortable with her grief. "Thank you," she managed. They set out as the sun crested the eastern peaks, following the main trail out of town, before turning onto a less traveled path that wound steadily upward through pine and aspen groves. The day was clear but cold, their breath forming clouds that dissipated in the thin mountain air. Owen didn't press her for conversation as they rode, seemingly content to follow her lead and observe the landscape. Occasionally, he made notes in a small leather-bound book or consulted a compass, but mostly he simply watched the terrain, the sky, and Lucille noticed with some discomfort her. Not in the way men sometimes watched women with hunger or assessment, but with genuine curiosity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. It made her both nervous and oddly flattered. By midday, they had reached a high ridge that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. Montezuma looked like a child's toy village from this height, smoke rising in thin columns from chimneys, the silver ribbon of the creek winding through its center. "Beautiful country," Owen commented as they dismounted to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, hard cheese, and biscuits. "Harsh, but beautiful." Lucille nodded, chewing slowly as she surveyed the familiar landscape. She'd come here often with her father, listening to his stories about the mountains and the people who had lived among them for generations before white settlers arrived. "Your father taught you well," Owen observed. "Most men wouldn't know these trails half as well as you do." She glanced at him, trying to determine if he was mocking her, but his expression showed only sincere appreciation. "He believed women should be self-sufficient," she said after a moment. "Not dependent on men for survival." Owen's mouth quirked upward. "Wise man, my mother would have agreed with him." He leaned back against a boulder. "She raised me and my brothers alone after my father was killed in the war. Taught us that strength comes in many forms, not all of them loud or obvious." Lucille felt a surprising connection at his words. "People mistake quietness for weakness," she said softly. "They do," Owen agreed, his eyes meeting hers. "It's their loss. Sometimes the quietest people have the most to offer if others would just listen." The moment stretched between them, unexpectedly intimate. Lucille looked away first, unused to such direct attention. "We should continue if we want to reach Shelton's Pass by nightfall," she said, rising and brushing crumbs from her skirt. They rode through the afternoon in companionable silence, the trail growing narrower and more treacherous as they ascended. Lucille pointed out landmarks and potential dangers, her voice growing slightly more confident with each explanation. Owen listened attentively, asking relevant questions that showed he valued her knowledge. By the time they made camp in a sheltered grove near the pass, Lucille realized she'd spoken more words to Owen Elliott in one day than she typically spoke in a week. Stranger still, it hadn't felt forced or uncomfortable. As they sat by the small campfire after a simple supper, the stars emerging in brilliant clusters above the dark silhouettes of pine trees, Owen pulled a flask from his coat. "Whiskey," he explained, offering it to her first, "helps keep the cold at bay." Lucille hesitated, then accepted it, taking a small sip that burned pleasantly down her throat. Her father, despite being a reverend, had believed in medicinal applications of spirits, particularly in mountain winters. "May I ask you something, Miss Parker?" Owen said after reclaiming the flask. She tensed slightly but nodded. "Why do you stay in Montezuma? It seems to me the town doesn't appreciate what they have in you." The directness of the question startled her. No one had ever asked her intentions before. They simply assumed she remained because she had nowhere else to go or lacked the courage to leave. "It's my home," she said finally. "My father is buried there, our church." She trailed off, struggling to articulate the complex web of attachment and obligation that kept her tethered to a place that often felt like it was suffocating her. Owen nodded thoughtfully. "Home is important," he agreed. "But sometimes what we think is home is just the place we've grown accustomed to being uncomfortable." The observation struck Lucille with unexpected force. Was Montezuma truly home or merely familiar discomfort? She'd never considered the distinction before. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself by initiating the question. "Where is your home?" A shadow crossed Owen's face. "I had one once. Ranch in Wyoming Territory, lost it when cattle prices fell 3 years ago." He stared into the fire. "Been working my way back ever since, taking whatever honest jobs I can find. This surveying work pays well enough that I might be able to start again soon on a smaller scale." "I'm sorry," Lucille said, meaning it. She understood loss, how it could reshape the entire landscape of one's life. "Don't be," Owen replied, his expression clearing. "It taught me what matters, not the land itself, but what you build on it, who you build with." He looked at her across the flames, his eyes reflecting golden sparks. "I like the silence with you, Lucille Parker. It's comfortable, not empty." The simple statement wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. No one had ever expressed such a sentiment before, that her silence could be a positive quality, a space of comfort rather than awkwardness. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to maintain eye contact under the intensity of his gaze. Later, as she lay wrapped in her bedroll listening to the night sounds of the forest and Owen's steady breathing from the other side of the now smoldering fire, Lucille turned his words over in her mind. "I like the silence with you." 5 simple words that acknowledged and validated a fundamental part of her nature that others had only ever tried to change. It was dangerous to read too much into such a statement, she knew. Owen Elliott was passing through her life, just as he was passing through Montezuma. In a week or two, he would be gone, continuing his journey toward rebuilding what he had lost. And she would remain, returning to her quiet existence on the edges of a community that tolerated but never embraced her. Yet something had shifted inside her today. A seed of possibility had taken root, suggesting that perhaps there were places or people in this world who might value her exactly as she was. It was a fragile hope, one she dared not examine too closely for fear it would crumble under scrutiny. As sleep finally claimed her, Lucille's last conscious thought was that tomorrow would bring another day of traveling alongside a man who found comfort rather than discomfort in her silence. And for now, that was enough. Morning arrived with a dusting of fresh snow and clouds building ominously to the west. Lucille studied the sky as she rekindled the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and porridge. "Storm coming," she observed when Owen emerged from his bedroll. "We should reach Conway's cabin by midday if we push hard. It's abandoned but sound." Owen nodded, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. "I trust your judgment. These mountains are your territory." They broke camp efficiently, working together without needing to discuss each task. By the time the sun had fully risen a pale disk behind increasingly thick clouds, they were already an hour along the trail toward the second potential route for the stage line. The path narrowed as they climbed, hugging the mountainside with a steep drop to their right. Lucille led the way, Bartholomew picking his steps carefully along the rocky trail. Behind her, she could hear Owen occasionally murmuring encouragement to Caesar and the pack mule. The wind picked up as the morning progressed, carrying the first scattered snowflakes. Lucille pulled her scarf higher around her face and pressed forward. If her calculations were correct, they should reach the old trapper's cabin before the worst of the storm hit. How much farther to this cabin? Owen called as the snowfall intensified, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. "Less than an hour," Lucille replied, raising her voice against the wind. "There's a valley just beyond this ridge, then a short climb to the cabin site." They pushed onward as the storm worsened, snow now falling heavily and accumulating rapidly on the trail. Lucille kept her focus on finding the markers. Her father had taught her to recognize a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive rock formation, the subtle widening of the path that indicated they were approaching the valley. When they finally descended into the sheltered basin, the force of the wind decreased noticeably, though the snow continued to fall in thick curtains around them. "The cabin is just beyond those trees," Lucille pointed, relief evident in her voice. The storm had developed faster and more intensely than she'd anticipated, and concern had been growing that they might need to make an emergency camp in the open. They urged their tired mounts through the deepening snow toward the stand of pines. As they emerged on the other side, the small log cabin came into view, a simple structure built decades ago by a trapper who had long since moved on or passed away. Lucille's father had discovered it during his travels and occasionally used it when caught in mountain storms. "Looks sturdy enough," Owen observed as they dismounted in front of the cabin. "Better than facing this blizzard without shelter." While Owen led the animals to the lean-to at the side of the cabin, Lucille pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was cold and dark but mercifully dry. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame provided basic comforts. Lucille immediately set about clearing debris from the fireplace and checking the chimney for blockages. By the time Owen entered, stamping snow from his boots, she had a small fire started with kindling from the wood box. "The animals are settled," he reported, removing his hat and coat. "I gave them extra feed. We might be here a while if this storm keeps up." Lucille nodded, already reaching for her pack to retrieve provisions. Being snowbound in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew wasn't ideal, but they had little choice. The alternative was risking their lives in the blizzard. "I'll get more firewood before it's completely buried," Owen said, pulling his coat back on. "We'll need to keep this fire going strong tonight." While he was outside, Lucille arranged their supplies and shook out the old bearskin that served as a mattress on the bed frame, checking for unwelcome wildlife that might have taken up residence. Finding it relatively clean, she laid out her bedroll on top of it, then hesitated, realizing the cabin offered no separate sleeping spaces. When Owen returned with an armload of logs, his beard and eyebrows frosted with snow, she was still standing beside the bed, uncertain. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said immediately, correctly interpreting her concern. "I've bedded down in worse places." He stacked the wood carefully beside the fireplace. "This should last through the night if we're careful." Lucille felt simultaneously relieved and oddly disappointed by his quick solution. "Thank you," she said simply. They settled into a quiet routine as the day progressed, the storm howling outside while they remained snug within the cabin's sturdy walls. Owen repaired a loose shutter while Lucille prepared a hot meal from their provisions. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling and snow occasionally sliding from the roof with a soft thump. "We could be here for days if this keeps up," Owen observed as darkness fell, the storm showing no signs of abating. "Will that cause problems for you back in town?" Lucille considered the question. Tommy Wilson will keep caring for my animals. Mrs. Hollister knows I'm guiding you. She shrugged slightly. Few others will notice my absence. Owen studied her face in the firelight. I find that hard to believe. A woman like you should be missed by many. She looked away, uncomfortable with the implied compliment. People notice what they want to notice, she said softly. In Montezuma, that's gold strikes and scandals, not quiet women who keep to themselves. Their loss, Owen said firmly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. May I ask why you're so reserved, Lucille? You speak when necessary and quite eloquently, yet you choose silence more often than not. The directness of the question might have offended her coming from someone else. From Owen, it felt like genuine interest rather than criticism. Words have always felt expensive, she explained hesitantly, as if each one cost something to produce and I should spend them wisely. Owen nodded thoughtfully. I've known people who throw words around carelessly, like tossing pennies into a fountain. They don't value what they say because it costs them nothing to say it. Exactly, Lucille agreed, surprised by his understanding. My father taught that speech as a gift to be used judiciously. Let your words be few but meaningful, he always said. A wise philosophy, Owen smiled. Though I admit I'm grateful when you do choose to spend those words with me, your voice is. He paused, seeming to search for the right description. It has depth, like still water that runs deeper than it appears. Lucille felt warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. No one had ever described her voice that way before, as something valuable rather than insufficient. Thank you, she said, meeting his eyes briefly, for listening when I do speak. Always, he replied simply. They talked intermittently through the evening, or rather, Owen asked thoughtful questions, and Lucille answered when she felt comfortable doing so. He told stories of his travels across the Western Territories, adventures and misadventures that made her smile and occasionally laugh softly. She found herself sharing memories of her father and their life together, surprised by how easily the words came in Owen's presence. As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault on the small cabin, Lucille felt a strange sense of peace descend. Here, miles from town and social expectations, she could simply be herself without constant judgment. It's getting late, Owen eventually observed, glancing at his pocket watch. You should take the bed, I'll be comfortable enough here. He gestured to his bedroll spread near the fire. Lucille nodded and rose, suddenly shy again as the intimacy of their situation reasserted itself. Good night, then. Good night, Lucille, he replied, his voice gentle in the firelit dimness. Sleep well. Despite her exhaustion from the day's journey, sleep eluded Lucille for some time. She lay listening to the storm and Owen's steady breathing, her mind turning over the strange circumstances that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she would never have imagined herself snowbound in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew, yet now it seemed almost inevitable, as if their paths had been destined to cross in exactly this way. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Lucille had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood, convinced that no man would willingly choose a wife who spoke so little. Her previous suitors had all eventually withdrawn when faced with her reserved nature, finding it too strange or unsettling for a lifetime commitment. Yet Owen Elliott seemed to find value in her quietness, even appreciation. It was a dangerous thought to entertain, she knew. He was passing through her life, not putting down roots. Whatever connection they shared existed in this temporary bubble, away from the realities of daily life. Still, as she finally drifted toward sleep, Lucille allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to be truly understood and accepted by someone like Owen, someone who liked the silence with her. Morning revealed a world transformed by the blizzard. When Lucille pushed open the cabin door, she found herself facing a wall of white nearly to her waist. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape glittering under a clear blue sky. We won't be traveling today, Owen observed, coming to stand beside her in the doorway. Not until some of this melts or settles. Lucille nodded her agreement. Even knowing these mountains intimately, attempting to navigate through snow this deep would be foolhardy at best, deadly at worst. "The southern slopes will clear first," she said. "By tomorrow, perhaps." They spent the day in domestic harmony, Owen venturing out to check on the animals and clear paths to the lean-to and woodpile while Lucille took inventory of their supplies and prepared meals. Between these necessary tasks they talked, or rather, Owen talked and Lucille listened, occasionally offering her own thoughts when she felt moved to do so. She learned more about his life in Wyoming, the small ranch he'd built with his own hands and lost to economic forces beyond his control. He spoke of his dreams to start again, perhaps in Colorado where land was still available for reasonable prices. "Have you considered staying in Montezuma?" Lucille asked during a lull in the conversation, surprising herself with the question. Owen looked thoughtful. "I hadn't specifically." "Is there much ranching in the area?" "Some in the lower valleys," she replied. "Most focus on mining, but there's good grazing land to the east." "Something to consider," Owen said, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Though I suspect the welcome for newcomers varies depending on who's doing the welcoming." Lucille understood his meaning immediately. Montezuma, like many frontier towns, had its established hierarchies and prejudices. A former rancher with little capital would face challenges breaking into the community. "People eventually accept what becomes familiar," she said quietly. "Or so my father believed. Your father sounds like a man I would have respected greatly," Owen replied. "He would have liked you," Lucille said, the words emerging before she could reconsider them. Owen's smile warmed his entire face. "That's high praise indeed, coming from you." The day passed more quickly than Lucille would have expected, given their confinement. By evening, the temperature had risen enough that some snow had begun to melt from the southern exposures, creating occasional small avalanches from the cabin roof. "We should be able to travel tomorrow," Owen observed as they finished their supper, "though the going will be slow." Lucille nodded, feeling an unexpected pang at the thought. Their time in this cabin had created a strange intimacy between them, a space where she felt more herself than she had in years. Returning to the trail meant eventually returning to Montezuma and reality. "Something troubling you?" Owen asked, noticing her silence had shifted quality. She shook her head, then reconsidered. Owen had been nothing but honest with her. She owed him the same courtesy. "I've enjoyed these days," she admitted softly, "despite the circumstances." "As have I," he replied, his voice equally soft. "Perhaps especially because of the circumstances." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Lucille, a sudden commotion outside interrupted whatever he had been about to say. The horses were nickering loudly, and Bartholomew's distinctive bray rose above the other sounds. Owen was on his feet immediately, reaching for his pistol. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the door. Lucille ignored the command, grabbing her father's rifle from where it leaned against the wall. She followed Owen outside, where the fading light revealed the cause of the animal's distress, a large mountain lion prowling near the lean-to, hunger evidently overwhelming its natural caution around humans. The big cat snarled at their appearance, its tail lashing dangerously. The horses stomped and pulled at their tethers, eyes rolling in fear. "Easy," Owen murmured, raising his pistol. "I don't have a clear shot with the animals in the way." Without hesitation, Lucille moved to the side, her rifle already braced against her shoulder. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, insisting that in these mountains, such skills could mean the difference between life and death. She exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger with practiced precision. The shot cracked through the still evening air, and the mountain lion dropped instantly. Owen turned to her with undisguised admiration. "That was one hell of a shot," he said, genuine respect in his voice. Lucille lowered the rifle, her heart pounding more from his praise than from the encounter itself. "My father insisted I learn," she explained. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Lucille Parker," Owen said, a new warmth in his gaze. "You continue to surprise me at every turn." Together they calmed the horses, checked them for any injuries, and dragged the mountain lion's carcass away from the cabin. Owen efficiently skinned the animal, explaining that the pelt would fetch a good price, and the meat could supplement their provisions. By the time they returned inside, full darkness had fallen. The cabin seemed smaller somehow, more intimate in the aftermath of the shared danger. Lucille was acutely aware of Owen's presence as he stoked the fire, his movements deliberate and controlled. "What you did out there," he said finally, turning to face her. "Most men couldn't have made that shot, let alone with such composure." Lucille shrugged slightly, uncomfortable with the praise yet warmed by it simultaneously. "Necessity teaches quickly?" "Perhaps," Owen acknowledged. "But courage and skill are innate qualities. You possess both in abundance." He took a step toward her. "Lucille, I know we've only known each other a few days, but I feel." He stopped, seeming to struggle for words for the first time since she'd met him. "I don't want to overstep," he continued after a moment. "Your good opinion matters to me more than I can explain." Lucille felt her heart quicken. She wasn't naive, she recognized the direction of his thoughts. Part of her wanted to retreat, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment when he realized that her quietness wasn't temporary or situational but fundamental to her nature. Yet another part, a braver, more hopeful part, urged her forward. Owen had seen her at her most authentic and still valued what he saw. That was more than anyone else had ever offered. "You're not overstepping," she said softly, meeting his gaze directly. The tension between them shifted, charged with possibility. Owen moved closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped away if she wished. When she remained in place, he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle against her skin. "I like the silence with you, Lucille," he said, repeating his earlier words with new meaning. "It feels right, somehow, comfortable in a way I've never experienced before." The simple truth of his statement resonated deep within her. Lucille had spent her life feeling like her silence was a barrier between herself and others. Owen was the first to suggest it might instead be a connection, a shared language of comfort rather than an absence of communication. "I feel the same," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. Owen's smile illuminated his entire face. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it felt like a question. Lucille had been kissed twice before, awkward, fumbling interactions with suitors who had eventually rejected her quietness. This was entirely different. Owen's kiss held patience and understanding, asking nothing but offering everything. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searching hers for confirmation, Lucille felt something shift and settle inside her, as if a piece long missing had finally found its place. "I never expected this," Owen admitted, his voice husky. "When I came to Montezuma, I was focused only on the job, on earning enough to start again somewhere new." He traced her cheekbone with his thumb. "Now I find myself reconsidering what starting again might mean." Lucille understood the implicit question in his words. It was too soon, far too soon, for concrete plans or promises. They had known each other only days, however meaningful those days had been. "We should sleep," she said gently. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Owen nodded, accepting her redirection without offense. "You're right, of course." He stepped back, though reluctance was evident in every line of his body. "Good night, Lucille." "Good night, Owen," she replied, his first name feeling intimate on her tongue. As she settled onto the bed, Lucille's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Excitement and fear battled for dominance, hope and practicality waged their own war. Owen Elliott had entered her life like a sudden Chinook wind, melting defenses she hadn't realized were frozen solid. Yet experience had taught her caution. Men's affections could change quickly, especially when confronted with the realities of her nature. What seemed charming or intriguing in the isolation of a mountain cabin might become frustrating or disappointing in the context of normal life. Still, as sleep finally claimed her, Lucille allowed herself to nurture the small flame of hope that had ignited in her heart. For the first time in longer than she could remember, tomorrow seemed to offer possibilities rather than merely more of the same. Morning brought clearer skies and slightly reduced snow depths. After a quick breakfast and careful packing, they set out to continue their journey. both tacitly agreeing to focus on the practical matter of completing the survey rather than addressing the charged moment they had shared the previous evening. The going was difficult, as Owen had predicted. The horses struggled through snow that sometimes reached their bellies in drifted areas. Progress was painfully slow, and by midday they had covered less than half the distance Lucille would normally expect. "We should consider turning back to the cabin for another night," Owen suggested as they paused to rest the animals. "At this rate, we won't reach the next shelter before dark." Lucille scanned the horizon, mentally calculating distances and conditions. "There's a mining camp about 3 hours ahead if we can maintain this pace," she said. "Abandoned now, but the buildings were intact last spring." Owen deferred to her judgment, and they pressed onward through the challenging terrain. The sun broke through occasionally, creating a dazzling glare off the snow that made navigation even more difficult. Lucille led them with quiet confidence, recognizing landmarks despite their transformed appearance under the blanket of white. By late afternoon, the abandoned mining camp came into view, a cluster of rough cabins and equipment sheds nestled in a protected hollow. As they approached, Lucille noted with relief that the structures appeared largely undamaged by the recent storm. "Silver played out 2 years ago," she explained as they dismounted before the largest cabin. "The company pulled out, but left everything standing in case they want to return." The cabin was dusty but sound, with bunks, a table, and a pot-bellied stove that soon warmed the space once they had it lit. Owen tended to the animals while Lucille prepared their evening meal, the domestic routine already feeling familiar after their time in the trapper's cabin. "We've covered about half the second proposed route," Owen observed as they ate. "From what I've seen, it has advantages over the first, though that final ascent today would be challenging for a stagecoach." Lucille nodded. "Spring and summer would be manageable. Winter would require alternate routes." They discussed the practicalities of the survey, keeping the conversation carefully focused on the task at hand rather than personal matters. Yet Lucille was acutely aware of every glance, every moment their hands accidentally brushed, every unspoken current running beneath their words. As they cleared away the remains of their meal, Owen finally broke the careful distance they had maintained throughout the day. "About last night," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I want you to know I meant what I said. It wasn't just the circumstances or the isolation speaking." Lucille stilled, her hands resting on the table. "How can you be sure?" she asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. "You've known me only days and in unusual conditions." Owen considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Fair point," he acknowledged. "I can't be absolutely certain. No one can predict the future." He moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel his warmth. "But I know how I feel in your presence, comfortable in a way I've rarely experienced. Your silence doesn't unsettle me, it reassures me." He smiled softly. "Where I come from, people judge a person by their actions more than their words. You've shown me your character through what you do, not what you say. That speaks volumes to me." Lucille felt tears prick behind her eyes at his understanding. "Most men want a wife who entertains their friends, who fills silences with pleasant chatter," she said, voicing the rejection she had experienced repeatedly. "I'm not most men," Owen replied simply. "And what I want is someone genuine, someone who speaks when she has something worth saying and remains silent when she doesn't." His eyes held her steadily. "I want someone like you, Lucille Parker." The directness of his statement left no room for misinterpretation. Lucille felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the possibilities it presented. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, the irony of her statement not lost on either of them. Owen's smile widened. "You don't need to say anything right now, we have time." He reached out slowly, giving her the opportunity to withdraw, and took her hand in his. "I'm not asking for promises, just the chance to see where this might lead when we return to town." The reasonable request calmed some of Lucille's anxiety. He wasn't proposing marriage after just days of acquaintance, merely suggesting they continue to explore the connection they had discovered. "I would like that," she said softly, curling her fingers around his. The acknowledgement seemed to satisfy Owen. He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, then released her without pushing for more. We should rest. Tomorrow will be another challenging day. As they prepared for sleep in their separate bunks, Lucille reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The journey that had begun as a simple business arrangement had evolved into something far more significant. For the first time since her father's death, she felt hope for a future that might include companionship rather than isolation. Whether that hope would withstand the scrutiny of town life and social expectations remained to be seen. But for tonight, in this quiet mining cabin surrounded by snow-covered mountains, it felt like a possibility worth embracing. The remaining days of their expedition passed in a blend of professional purpose and growing personal connection. They completed the survey of all 3 potential routes, Owen making detailed notes and sketches while Lucille provided invaluable insights about seasonal conditions and local terrain. The work gave structure to their days while allowing natural opportunities for conversation and shared experiences. Owen never pressed Lucille to speak more than she was comfortable with, seemingly content with her measured contributions and comfortable silences. In turn, she found herself gradually opening up, sharing thoughts and observations she might normally have kept private. It wasn't that she became suddenly talkative, rather that she felt safe expressing herself when and how she chose, without fear of judgment. On their final night in the wilderness, camped in a protected grove with the lights of Montezuma visible in the distant valley, Owen broached the subject of their return to town. "People will talk," he said matter-of-factly as they sat beside the campfire. "A week alone in the mountains with the quiet Miss Parker will give the gossips plenty to chew on." Lucille nodded, having already considered this reality. "It doesn't matter what they say about me," she replied. "My reputation was already peculiar at best." Owen frowned. "It matters to me. I won't have your name sullied because you helped me with this survey." He stared into the flames for a moment, then continued, "I've been thinking about how to address this. The simplest solution would be for me to move on immediately after we return, minimize the association between us." The suggestion sent a cold wave through Lucille that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No," Owen answered firmly. "That's the last thing I want, but I'll do it if you feel it would be best for your situation." Relief flooded through her. "And if I don't?" Owen's expression softened. "Then I'd like to stay in Montezuma, at least for a while. The telegraph office is hiring, and I have experience from my time in Cheyenne." He reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I'd like the chance to court you properly, Lucille. No rushing, no pressure, just the opportunity to see if what we've discovered here can thrive there." The sincerity in his voice and eyes made her throat tighten with emotion. "I would like that too," she managed. His smile was worth every word she'd spoken. "Then that's what we'll do. Let the gossips talk, we know the truth of matters." As they rode into Montezuma the following afternoon, Lucille was acutely aware of curious glances from townspeople they passed. Word of their return spread quickly, and by the time they reached her homestead, several neighbors had found excuses to be out in their yards despite the cold. Owen handled the situation with diplomatic grace, greeting people politely but offering no details about their expedition beyond its professional purpose. He helped Lucille unload her supplies and settle Bartholomew, maintaining a respectful distance while in public view. "I'll return tomorrow to check on Caesar," he said as he prepared to lead his own mount back to town. "If that's acceptable to you." Lucille nodded, conscious of Mrs. Thornton watching intently from across the road. "Thank you for the fair wage," she said clearly, loud enough to be overheard. "Your company was satisfied with my services as a guide, I hope." Owen's eyes crinkled at her strategic approach. "More than satisfied, Miss Parker. Your knowledge of the mountain passes was invaluable." He tipped his hat formally. "Until tomorrow, then." As he rode away, Lucille turned to find Tommy Wilson hovering nearby, eager to report on his care of her animals during her absence. She listened to his excited recounting of every egg collected and meal provided, rewarding him with additional coins that made his eyes widen with delight. "Mr. Elliott seems nice," Tommy commented as he pocketed his payment. "Not stuck up like some folks." He leaned closer conspiratorially. "Ma says he's been asking about purchasing the old Davidson property, says he wants to start a small cattle operation." This was news to Lucille. Owen hadn't mentioned any concrete plans for remaining in the area, despite his stated intention to court her. The thought that he might be considering putting down roots sent a flutter of excitement through her chest. "Is that so?" She replied neutrally, not wanting to feed the boy's obvious curiosity. Tommy nodded vigorously. "Yep, and Mrs. Hollister told Ma he's been asking all sorts of questions about you, too respectful-like, but interested for sure." Lucille felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air. "Thank you again for caring for the animals, Tommy," she said, gently but firmly ending the conversation. "You did an excellent job." The boy beamed at the praise before scampering off, undoubtedly to report this brief interaction to his mother, who would share it with her sewing circle, who would disseminate it throughout town by supper time. Such was the nature of Montezuma's communication network, more efficient than the telegraph in its own way. That evening, alone in her cabin for the first time in over a week, Lucille found the silence oddly emptier than it had been before. She had grown accustomed to Owen's presence, his deep voice, his considerate movements, the comfort of knowing someone else was nearby who accepted her completely. Sleep came reluctantly, her mind spinning with possibilities and uncertainties about what the coming days might bring. Owen had promised to court her properly, but what exactly did that entail? More importantly, would the connection they had formed in the wilderness survive the scrutiny and constraints of town life? Morning brought a light dusting of fresh snow and a knock at her door just as Lucille finished her breakfast. She opened it to find Owen standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaved and unnervingly handsome in a clean shirt and vest. "Good morning," he greeted, his smile warming his entire face. "I've come to check on Caesar as promised." He hesitated, then added, "and to ask if you might accompany me to services tomorrow. I understand your father's church still operates under Reverend Simmons." The invitation was traditional, respectable, exactly the sort of public outing that would signal his intentions were honorable without being overly forward. Lucille appreciated the careful consideration behind it. "Yes, I attend regularly," she confirmed. "I would be pleased to accompany you." "Excellent," his smile broadened. "I've spoken with Widow Sullivan about extended lodging arrangements, and I've made some inquiries about available properties in the area, so Tommy's information had been correct." "I heard," Lucille admitted. "News travels quickly here." Owen chuckled. "So I've discovered. Mrs. Sullivan informed me of no fewer than 3 potential marriage matches the town has attempted to arrange for you, along with detailed explanations of why each failed." His expression grew more serious. "She seemed particularly determined to warn me about your excessive quietness," as she put it. Lucille winced inwardly, though she wasn't surprised. "And what did you say to that?" "I told her I find your thoughtful nature refreshing in a world where too many speak without thinking." His eyes held hers steadily. "I believe my exact words were that I like the silence with you." The echo of his earlier sentiment, now shared publicly, sent a wave of warmth through Lucille. It was one thing to say such things in the privacy of a mountain cabin, quite another to declare them to the town's most notorious gossip. "Mrs. Sullivan likely found that perplexing," she observed, fighting a smile. "Thoroughly," Owen confirmed with a grin. "Though I believe she's now convinced I'm either the most understanding man in Colorado territory or completely addled in the head." He gestured toward the barn. "Shall we check on Caesar? Then perhaps you might show me around your property. I'd like to understand how you've managed it alone these months." They spent the morning touring the homestead, Lucille pointing out her father's improvements and explaining her methods for maintaining the place with minimal assistance. Owen listened attentively, asking intelligent questions and offering occasional suggestions based on his ranching experience. "You've done remarkably well," he said as they completed the circuit. "Many men couldn't have managed half so efficiently." The genuine admiration in his voice touched Lucille deeply. Unlike the condescension, she often received praise that implied surprise that a woman, particularly a quiet one, could accomplish anything practical. Owen's respect felt authentic and equal. "Thank you," she said simply. "It was important to me to honor my father's work. He would be proud," Owen replied. "Of that I have no doubt." The day passed quickly, and when Owen finally took his leave in the late afternoon, Lucille felt a sense of anticipation rather than loss. He would return tomorrow to escort her to church, a public declaration of interest that would set the town talking even more vigorously. Strangely, the prospect didn't trouble her as it once might have. Owen's confidence in their connection gave her courage she hadn't realized she possessed. Let them talk. For once, the gossip might lead to something positive rather than painful. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Lucille dressed with particular care in her best navy wool dress with its modest lace collar. She arranged her hair in a simple but elegant knot, and added her mother's cameo brooch, small touches that might not be noticeable to most, but made her feel more confident. Owen arrived promptly in a rented buggy, looking distinguished in a dark suit that, while not new, was well maintained and properly fitted. The appreciative glance he gave her as she emerged from the cabin conveyed more than words could have expressed. "You look beautiful," he said simply, helping her into the buggy. The drive to town was pleasant despite the cold, their conversation flowing easily between practical matters and more personal reflections. As they approached the white clapboard church at the edge of town, Lucille became increasingly aware of curious glances from other parishioners making their way inside. "Ready?" Owen asked quietly, correctly reading her tension. Lucille took a deep breath and nodded. Owen secured the horses, then offered his arm with formal correctness. Together they walked into the church, where conversations immediately hushed as heads turned in their direction. Reverend Simmons, a kind-faced man in his 50s who had taken over the congregation after her father's death, approached them with a warm smile. "Miss Parker, always a pleasure," he greeted, then extended his hand to Owen. "And you must be Mr. Elliott. I've heard you've been exploring our mountain passes." "Yes, sir," Owen replied respectfully. "Miss Parker was an invaluable guide. Her knowledge of the terrain is exceptional." The Reverend's smile broadened. "Indeed." Reverend Parker made certain his daughter could navigate these mountains as well as any man. He glanced between them with knowing eyes. "I'm pleased to see you both this morning. Please, let me show you to a seat." He led them to a pew near the middle of the church, not too forward to seem presumptuous, not too far back to suggest reluctance. As they settled, Lucille was acutely aware of whispers and glances from surrounding congregants. Mrs. Henderson, mother of her most recent rejected suitor, stared openly with narrowed eyes. Owen, seemingly oblivious to the attention, sat comfortably beside Lucille, his solid presence reassuring. Throughout the service, he maintained a respectful distance while still making their association clear to all observers. When the hymns were sung, he shared his hymnal with her, his rich baritone blending pleasantly with the congregation. After the service concluded, the real scrutiny began as parishioners gathered outside to socialize. Owen kept Lucille's hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm as they navigated the crowd, fielding greetings and not-so-subtle inquiries with easy grace. "Mr. Elliott, I understand you're considering property in our area," Mrs. Baxter commented, her eyes darting between him and Lucille. "Something permanent, perhaps. I'm exploring possibilities," Owen replied noncommittally. "Montezuma has much to recommend it." His gaze briefly met Lucille's, communicating without words that she was foremost among those recommendations. "Well, we're always pleased to welcome new residents," Mrs. Baxter continued, "especially those with agricultural experience, so different from our mining focus." The conversation continued in this vein, seemingly innocent remarks loaded with subtext and assessment. Owen handled each interaction diplomatically, neither confirming nor denying the obvious speculation about his intentions toward Lucille. For her part, Lucille remained largely silent, as was her custom in social gatherings. But unlike previous occasions where her quietness had been met with discomfort or disapproval, Owen's presence beside her somehow transformed perception. Her silence became something to respect rather than remedy, particularly when Owen occasionally deferred to her with genuine interest in her opinion. "Miss Parker was just explaining to me yesterday about the water rights in the Eastern Valley," he commented during one conversation about local properties. "Her understanding of the legal nuances is quite impressive." Such remarks, delivered casually but sincerely, gradually shifted the dynamic of their interactions with the townspeople. By the time they departed for lunch at the hotel dining room, another publicly visible activity, the tenor of whispers had changed from skepticism to cautious approval. "That went better than I expected," Lucille admitted quietly as they were seated at a table near the window. Owen smiled. "People are generally willing to reconsider their judgments when presented with a different perspective." He unfolded his napkin. "Besides, they can hardly claim you're unsuitable when it's clear I find you entirely suitable." The direct statement brought warmth to Lucille's cheeks. "You've been very kind, not kind," he corrected gently. "Honest, there's a significant difference." He reached across the table to briefly touch her hand. "I mean every word I say, Lucille, never doubt that." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tighten with emotion. No one, since her father, had looked at her with such complete acceptance and appreciation. "I believe you," she said softly. Their courtship progressed with deliberate propriety over the following weeks. Owen secured a position at the telegraph office while continuing to explore available properties. He called on Lucille regularly, escorting her to church services, community gatherings, and occasionally Mrs. Hollister's home for proper chaperoned visits. Throughout, he never pressured Lucille to be more talkative than was natural for her, instead creating spaces where her quietness was comfortable rather than awkward. When they were alone, always within proper boundaries, they developed a rhythm of communication that required fewer words than most couples, but conveyed deeper understanding. "You're good for her," Mrs. Hollister observed to Owen one afternoon when Lucille had stepped into another room. "She smiles more now, speaks more too when she has something to say." "She always had thoughts worth hearing," Owen replied. "She just needed someone willing to listen properly." By early spring, Owen had purchased a modest property east of town, 30 acres, with a small cabin and outbuildings that could support a scaled-down version of his former ranching operation. He worked tirelessly to repair and improve the place, often with Lucille's assistance during her free hours. "It's not much compared to what I had in Wyoming," he admitted as they sat on the newly rebuilt porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "But it has potential." Lucille understood he wasn't speaking solely of the land. Their relationship had developed steadily, deepening into something neither had expected to find in Montezuma. The town had gradually adjusted its perception of quiet Miss Parker, particularly as they observed Owen's genuine appreciation for her nature. "I've been thinking," Owen continued after a comfortable silence, "that this place needs a woman's touch to truly become a home." He turned to face her directly. "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "Lucille Parker, I love you exactly as you are, your thoughtfulness, your capability, your comfortable silences. I don't want to change a single thing about you." His eyes held her steadily. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "I promise to always value the silence we share as much as the words." Tears blurred Lucille's vision as emotion overwhelmed her. The journey from rejection to acceptance, from being deemed too quiet to being loved specifically for that quietness, seemed almost miraculous. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of all she felt. Owen's face illuminated with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her, Lucille felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment, every painful rejection preparing her to recognize and treasure true acceptance when it finally appeared. They were married in her father's church on a perfect June morning, with Reverend Simmons officiating. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by most of the town, some out of genuine goodwill, others from curiosity about the union between the taciturn Miss Parker and the forthright Mr. Elliott. "I take you, Lucille, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Owen vowed, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "I promise to cherish your thoughtful nature, to value your wisdom, and to find comfort in our silences together for as long as we both shall live." Lucille's corresponding vows were spoken softly but with complete conviction, her eyes never leaving Owen's as she pledged herself to him. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Simmons declared, beaming at the couple. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The celebration afterward at their new home was livelier than many had expected, with Owen ensuring that Lucille wasn't overwhelmed by the social demands of hosting. He stayed close throughout the afternoon, creating a buffer when needed and drawing her naturally into conversations where her expertise or opinions were relevant. "They make an unusual pair," Mrs. Baxter remarked to Mrs. Whitman as they watched the couple greeting guests, "but somehow it works. He seems to genuinely prefer her quietness. Perhaps he's wise enough to know that those who speak least often have the most important things to say," Reverend Simmons commented as he passed by. Reverend Parker always said his daughter observed more in silence than most people discovered through endless talking. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Owen found Lucille standing alone on the porch, watching the sunset that had become their shared ritual. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Lucille leaned back against his chest, feeling complete in a way she had never imagined possible. "Perfectly," she replied. "Me too," Owen murmured against her hair. "I like the silence with you, Mrs. Elliott, always have, always will." In that moment, as the golden light faded from the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lucille finally understood that her quietness had never been a flaw to overcome, but a gift waiting for the right person to appreciate it. Owen had seen value where others saw deficiency, potential where others saw limitation. And in the comfortable silence they shared as husband and wife, watching night fall over their mountain home, there was more profound communication than could ever be contained in endless words. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Elliots. Owen's small ranching operation grew steadily, if modestly, providing a comfortable living. Lucille continued her work with Mrs. Hollister while helping manage their home and land, her quiet efficiency earning respect throughout the community. Their first child, a son they named Michael after Owen's father, arrived the following spring, a sturdy, healthy boy with his father's expressive eyes, and as he grew, his mother's thoughtful nature. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah joined the family, bringing with her a sunny disposition that complemented her brother's more reserved character. Through the children's early years, Lucille discovered a voice she hadn't fully realized she possessed, a patient, nurturing tone used for bedtime stories and gentle guidance. Owen often paused in doorways to listen as she spoke more freely with their children than she did with almost anyone else, her natural reserve softening in the safety of family bonds. "They bring out another side of you," he observed one evening after the children were asleep. "It's beautiful to witness," Lucille smiled, understanding his meaning. "They know me," she said simply. As you do, the town's perception of Lucille had shifted dramatically over the years. Where once she had been that strange, quiet Parker girl, she gradually became the capable Elliott wife whose few words carried weight when offered. When she did choose to speak at community meetings or church functions, people learned to listen attentively, knowing her contributions would be thoughtful and worthwhile. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Owen surprised Lucille with a special gift, a handcrafted wooden sign for their ranch entrance that reads Stillwater, with a small stream carved beneath the letters. "Because still waters run deep," he explained as she traced the carved lettering with her fingers. Like you. The name stuck, and soon Stillwater Ranch became known throughout the region for its quality stock and principled management. Owen's business sense combined with Lucille's careful attention to detail created a respected operation that, while never the largest in the area, was among the most respected. As their children grew, Lucille found unexpected fulfillment in teaching them the values her father had instilled in her, not just practical skills of survival and self-sufficiency, but the deeper wisdom of knowing when to speak and when silence was more powerful than words. "Words matter," she told 7-year-old Michael one evening after he'd repeated town gossip at the dinner table. "Use them carefully for things worth saying." "Like you do, Mama?" he asked, his serious expression so like her own that Owen chuckled across the table. "Exactly like your mother," Owen confirmed. "She taught me that listening is often more important than talking." Young Sarah, then 5 and generally more talkative than her brother, considered this with furrowed brow. "But I like talking," she protested. Lucille smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "And your voice brings us joy. Different people express themselves in different ways. Neither is wrong if done with kindness and thought." This balance of personalities and expression created a household where both quietness and animation were equally valued, a haven where each family member felt accepted for their natural tendencies, rather than pressured to conform to a single standard. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Owen took Lucille's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with the smile lines that had deepened over the years. Lucille considered the question seriously, as was her way. Her life had transformed from one of isolation and misunderstanding to one rich with purpose and connection. The town that had once viewed her silence as a defect now respected her measured words. The rejections that had once wounded her so deeply now seemed like necessary steps on the path that led to where she belonged. "Not one," she answered truthfully, squeezing his hand. "Everything led me here." Owen nodded, understanding all she didn't need to say. "I thank God every day for bringing me to Montezuma," he said, "and for giving me the sense to recognize what others couldn't see." As twilight settled around them and their children's laughter echoed across the yard, Lucille reflected on the extraordinary journey from being the bride rejected for her quietness to being the wife cherished for that very quality. Owen had seen value in her silence when others saw only emptiness, had heard meaning in her few words when others heard only insufficiency. "I like the silence with you," he had said on that mountainside years ago, a simple phrase that had changed the course of her life. 5 ordinary words that had recognized and affirmed her truest self. And in the comfortable silence they still shared each evening, watching day transform into night over their mountain home, Lucille found all the eloquence that mattered, the unspoken language of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly as they were.